Welcome to Life Stories. Sometimes the deadliest storms aren't the ones that tear across the ocean. They're the ones we carry inside us. For 20 years, Jack Mercer has lived a quiet life on the water, a man who walks the line between solitude and exile, hiding from a past that nearly broke him. But when fate throws him into the path of a life or death choice, the ocean won't be the only thing pulling him under. This is a story about the weight of guilt, the cost of courage, and the moment you're forced to decide who you really are. It will challenge what you believe about second chances and about the kind of man who can't stop running from himself. Now, as the wind rises and the waves begin to build, the question isn't if Jack will face the storm, it's what he'll lose when he does. The storm rolled in like a living thing, black clouds boiling over the horizon, lightning cracking so violently it painted the sea in ghostly light. Captain Jack Mercer stood alone in the wheelhouse of his weathered trawler, Second Wind, his calloused hands gripping the wheel with a quiet certainty. At 64, he had spent more of his life on the water than on land, yet every storm still carried the same taste of metal in his mouth, the same knot in his chest. This one was a monster, the kind that swallowed ships whole. And somewhere deep inside him, the part of Jack that he had tried to bury for 2 decades, the part trained to run toward danger instead of away from it, was stirring. Miguel, the youngest of his 2-man crew, leaned into the wheelhouse, rainwater streaming off his hood. "Jack, this one's moving faster than they forecasted." Jack's eyes stayed fixed on the wall of waves ahead. "Forecasts are for people on land," he said, his voice low, almost calm. Liam, his first mate of 15 years, suggested cutting the nets and heading in. Jack didn't even look at him. "We finished the run." They both knew there was no point arguing. When Jack Mercer set his course, not even the ocean could turn him. But then, on the radar, something. A massive shape, drifting sideways in the storm. Liam squinted. No engines, no wake, they're dead in the water. The right move, the safe move, would be to call it in and keep going. Jack knew the Coast Guard was hours away. The sea wouldn't wait that long. He told the crew to haul in the nets. Neither man had ever seen their captain abandon a fishing haul. They didn't know that before Jack was a fisherman. He had been one of the Navy's elite rescue swimmers, the kind who leapt from helicopters into seas like this to save strangers. They didn't know about the night that went wrong, the lives lost, and the guilt that drove him from the service. Through the rain-streaked windows, the vessel came into view. The Ocean Arrow, a sleek research ship now listing hard to port, its rail almost under. 8 figures clung to the tilting deck, 2 of them injured. Among them, a woman in a yellow jacket, her stance firm, her voice steady, even as she shouted over the wind that some of her people couldn't jump. Jack stripped off his heavy coat, cinched a lifeline around his waist, and in the next heartbeat, dove into the freezing chaos. The sea hit like a fist, but instinct took over. He moved with the waves, not against them, guiding the injured first toward the Second Wind, where Miguel and Liam hauled them aboard with urgent precision. The woman in the yellow jacket, Dr. Emily Carter, refused to leave until the last of her team was safe. Jack got her there, moments before a rogue wave slammed broadside into the Ocean Arrow, splitting it in 2. The research vessel vanished beneath the surface, swallowed without ceremony. Back on board, shivering but still on his feet, Jack ignored her questions. "Your life or your data, Doctor," he had told her when she'd hesitated to abandon 20 years of research. That tone, hard, certain, was the voice of the man he once was, the man he thought he'd buried. By dawn, Harbor Point was in sight. Jack steered toward the commercial docks, away from the flashing lights of Coast Guard vehicles. He didn't want the attention, the paperwork, or the recognition. While Emily was tending to her people, Jack refueled, offloaded, and by the time she looked for him again, Second Wind was already disappearing into the mist. 6 hours later, under a sky scrubbed clean by the storm, Jack's crew spotted a Navy Seahawk helicopter closing fast. It wasn't the Coast Guard. It was 7th Fleet, Emily's world, not his. A rescue swimmer dropped into the water, climbed aboard, and handed Jack a sealed envelope. The name on the letter made his hands tighten. Vice Admiral William Carter. Inside, in a hand he remembered all too well, were the words, "My daughter told me what you did. We've been looking for you for a long time. There are things you should know." By the time they reached port again, the docks were lined with people, researchers, townsfolk, Navy officers, and at the front, Emily Carter beside her father, the man Jack hadn't seen in 20 years. Carter shook his hand and told him they could talk later, in private. But first came the public praise, the retelling of the rescue. Jack wanted none of it, but his eyes kept going to Carter's, steady, searching, as if the Admiral knew Jack's refusal to speak wasn't just stubbornness, but a shield against something far deeper. That evening, in the quiet wardroom of a Navy destroyer, Carter told him the truth he'd avoided for 2 decades. The mission that had ended his career, the one Jack blamed himself for, had not been his fault. Carter wanted him to train a new generation of rescue swimmers, not to rejoin the Navy, just to pass on the knowledge that still lived in his bones. Jack said no. He was a fisherman now. But the Admiral's parting words stayed with him. "You're both Jack. You always have been." The next morning, Miguel and Liam were waiting with someone unexpected, Petty Officer Jensen from the helicopter. She told him the trainees were already asking for him. Liam said quietly, "What you did out there, that's something you don't keep to yourself." Jack looked from his crew to the open water, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt the pull of both lives at once. Do you believe some skills, once earned, never truly fade? What would you do if your past came calling after you'd spent years trying to forget it? Jack Mercer thought the storm was behind him, but the real reckoning was waiting on shore, and it carried the weight of a choice he couldn't outrun. Jack Mercer had faced tempests that tore steel apart, but nothing in his years at sea had prepared him for the quiet storm brewing inside him now. The Navy destroyer still sat anchored in Port Camden, its gray silhouette cutting an imposing line against the afternoon sky. From the second wind's wheelhouse, Jack could see it every time he glanced toward the harbor mouth, a reminder of the conversation he tried to shut out. He told himself he'd agreed to just one training session, nothing more, but the truth was gnawing at him. If he stepped back into that world, even for a day, the past he'd spent 20 years outrunning would be waiting. When the day came, the naval training facility was alive with movement, waves slapping against the piers, cadets in wet suits jogging along the dock, and the smell of salt water mixed with diesel from idling boats. 8 trainees stood in formation, their eyes on him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They'd heard the story. Emily Carter was there too, leaning on a railing, her gaze fixed on Jack with a strange blend of gratitude and something else, expectation. Vice Admiral Carter stood beside her, arms folded, his expression unreadable. Jack spoke little, demonstrating more than explaining, letting the cold water and unpredictable currents teach the lessons words never could. He showed them how to move with the sea instead of against it, how to read the swells, when to hold a breath, when to let it out. The movements came back to him like muscle memory stitched into his bones. Watching the trainees struggle, then adapt, stirred something inside him. Pride, maybe, or a dangerous nostalgia. When one young man flailed in the chop, Jack was in the water before the instructors could react, hauling the kid back to safety with the same practiced efficiency that had once defined his life. The crowd on the pier clapped. Jack only nodded, breathing hard, pretending it was nothing. After the session, the Admiral invited him aboard the destroyer again. This time, Jack didn't refuse. In the wardroom, Carter slid a weathered folder across the table. "There's something you never knew about that night," he said. Jack's hands hovered over the folder, reluctant to touch it. Inside were after-action reports, witness statements, records he'd never seen. One report, stamped classified until recently, detailed a command decision Carter had made. They'd gone ahead with the rescue against weather advisories, knowing the risk. Jack scanned the lines, his jaw tightening as the truth hit him. He'd been carrying the blame for 2 decades, when the decision had been Carter's all along. Carter's voice was steady. "I thought protecting you meant letting you walk away, but maybe I just let you drown on dry land." The words landed heavier than any wave. Jack closed the folder, feeling the weight of years press in. You should have told me, he said quietly. Carter didn't flinch. Would you have stayed? Jack didn't answer. That night, Emily found him alone on the dock, leaning against the railing, watching the harbor lights shimmer on black water. My father's not perfect, she said, but neither are you. You think hiding from the sea absolves you, but it doesn't. You saved us because you still know how. And there are people out there who will need someone like you tomorrow, next week, next year. Are you really going to keep pretending you're just a fisherman? Her words cut, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. The next morning, as Jack prepared the second wine for another run, Petty Officer Jensen appeared again, this time with orders in her hand, not for training, for a mission. A research vessel, almost identical to the Ocean Arrow, had gone dark 30 miles offshore. The Coast Guard was stretched thin. The Navy needed civilian vessels in the area to respond immediately. Jack stared at the coordinates, his gut tightening. The weather was turning, again, and somewhere beyond those waves another crew might be waiting for a hand in the water. Liam and Miguel were watching him closely. It's your call, Captain, Liam said, though his tone left no doubt what he hoped the answer would be. Jack felt the pull of two truths, one life in the safety of the trawler's routine, another in the merciless grip of the sea where lives hung in the balance. And in that moment, with the wind rising and the destroyer's shadow still cast over the harbor, Jack Mercer realized the choice he made next could change everything. If you carried guilt for 20 years, only to find out you were never to blame, would it set you free or pull you back into the fire? Jack reached for the throttles, the hum of the engines growing into a roar, knowing that what waited beyond the harbor wasn't just another rescue. It was the one that might finally decide who he truly was. The wind tore across the deck of the second wind as Jack Mercer guided her into the teeth of the weather. The coordinates from the Navy pinged on the radar, a blinking dot 30 miles offshore, in the same waters where the Ocean Arrow had gone down. The sky was the color of lead, the swell building with every mile, each wave hitting with the force of a memory he tried for years to bury. Liam and Miguel moved with quiet purpose, checking lines and securing gear without being told. They knew the stakes. Out here, when the sea decided to take something, it rarely gave it back. The vessel appeared first as a smudge against the horizon, then a hulking shadow rocking unnaturally in the swell. Through binoculars, Jack saw her name painted along the stern, Blue Horizon. The decks were slick with rain and foam, and figures moved frantically, their shouts lost in the roar of the wind. The ship was listing to port, her bow rising sluggishly with each wave, too much water inside her belly. Jack called to Liam over the noise. We'll come in on her lee side. Get the heaving lines ready. Miguel's voice cut in from the bow, urgent. They've got injured. Jack's eyes locked on a figure being half carried by two others, their body limp. It was the same situation as before, too rough to bring the second wind directly alongside without risking both crews, which meant someone would have to swim. He didn't hesitate. The cold bite of the water hit like a memory. The current was strong, pulling sideways, but Jack angled into it, letting the rhythm of the waves do the work. He reached the Blue Horizon's rail just as another wave slammed into her hull. A crewman leaned over, eyes wide, and together they got the first injured man into the water, Jack towing him toward the second wind. Miguel was there in seconds, hauling the man aboard, then throwing a line for the next. Wave after wave, Jack returned. 3 trips, 4, each one harder than the last, as the cold leached the strength from his muscles. On the final run, the last person on deck refused to move. She was young, terrified, clinging to the rail as if letting go would mean death. Jack climbed halfway up, shouting over the wind. You've got to trust me! She shook her head, eyes wide with the raw panic he'd seen before, the kind that freezes you until it's too late. He didn't have time to argue. The ship gave a shudder, a groan deep in her bones, and Jack knew she was seconds from rolling. He reached for her, unhooked her white-knuckled grip, and jumped. The sea closed over them, black and freezing. She struggled, thrashing, swallowing water, but Jack held her tight, turning her so her face was to the sky, kicking hard for the trawler. His vision tunneled, breath ragged, but the shape of the second wind grew closer. Hands reached down, pulling her up first, then grabbing him. He collapsed on deck, coughing, the salt burning in his lungs. Liam's voice was in his ear. "That's all of them." Jack looked toward the blue horizon. She rolled, slow and terrible, then slipped beneath the waves, gone in less than a minute. The survivors huddled together in the second wind's galley, wrapped in blankets. The young woman sat apart, still shaking, staring at him. After a long moment, she whispered, "Why would you risk your life for strangers?" Jack paused, the answer rising from somewhere deep. "Because once, someone did the same for me." The run back to Port Camden was slow, the storm finally breaking as they approached. The Navy destroyer was still there, Admiral Carter and Emily waiting on the dock. Carter took one look at the survivors coming off the trawler and nodded once, the kind of nod that carried more weight than words. Emily stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "You can't keep saying you're not one of us, Jack." He met her eyes and for the first time didn't look away. Later, when the second wind was tied up and the crew dispersed, Jack stood alone on the deck, looking out over the water. The guilt he'd carried for 20 years felt different now. Not gone, but no longer the anchor that held him down. He thought about the trainees, about the young woman he'd pulled from the blue horizon, about the fact that maybe, just maybe, passing on what he knew wasn't just about teaching. It was about keeping a part of himself alive that he'd almost let die. The next morning, he walked up the destroyer's gangway, the salt wind in his face, and found Carter waiting. "If the offer's still open," Jack said, "I'll train them. Not part-time, full." Carter smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I was hoping you'd say that." Weeks later, the new class of rescue swimmers lined the pier for a drill. Jack moved among them, correcting stances, adjusting gear, his voice firm but never harsh. Emily watched from the dock, the same quiet pride in her eyes he'd once seen in the faces of the men and women he'd served with long ago. And when the call came in about a vessel in trouble, it was one of his trainees who leapt first into the water. Swift, confident, fearless. Jack felt the pull of the old life and knew, finally, that both his worlds had found their place. The sea would always be dangerous. It would always take. But now, because of what he'd chosen, it would also keep giving back. What did this story make you feel the most? Pride, sadness, or hope? If you enjoyed this story, comment 100 below. Tell us which country you're watching from and share this video with your friends. Thank you for watching Life Stories.